Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now, when I was a little fella, Darth Vader, he was the bad guy. Darth Vader and the Daleks, they were the ones that I loved as a kid. And it doesn't matter how long it's been or how many movies or TV shows there are, Darth Vader is still cool. So at last I wanted to paint something a little uncommon. I normally don't paint single black figures, so doing Vader seemed like a logical leap. Now this fella here is really centered at getting something on the table without a lot of fuss, so you'll probably see one or two points where I've cut some corners. But as well, I did make a couple of mistakes along the way, so if you're one of those who enjoys watching me come back from mistakes, well, there are one or two that you'll get to see in this video. So as always, all of the colors will be listed in the description below. Let's get started. So first of all, let's get a look at the miniature itself. Now this obviously is a 3D print. This has come off of an Elegoo Mars 3, which has been a really nice machine to use so far. Really beautiful results. Just a fractional amount of sanding to do to get a couple of the supports off. And the STL comes from Skullforge Studios, which I will link to in the description. This is part of the June Patreon pack. But they are available then through Gumroad, and at that link too, there's a whole list of international printers, so even if you don't have a printer and you want one of these specific miniatures, you can still get one. Now there's 4 poses in this month's pack. I've chosen this one because it's reminiscent of that comic page where he's standing there surrounded by rebel soldiers and delivers that line, "All I'm surrounded with is fear and dead men." And that's kind of rad, so this is the one I'm going to go with. I did very nearly pick menacingly striding forward, but I think in the end, that's a little more iconic. So I'm going to go outside, hit him with a primer, and get started painting. There he is. He's black. He's finished. But from here, we can do a little bit more in order to make him look more visually interesting. Now, I've used the Army Painter's matte black spray here, but any black primer will do the job. Black is black for our purposes here. What I am going to start with is by giving him an all-over coat of black-grey from Vallejo, and I can use quite a large brush to do this. Now it's going to look fairly light going on over that black, but as it dries it will darken down quite a bit, and of course we've got more to do to it. So I'm going to go over everything with this. I am going to repaint his helmet and his armor later, but for now just bucket this stuff all over him. You do not need to use a small brush at all. Just be careful with the lightsaber. So you'll see as it dries, it does darken down a lot, but comparing him to his base, you can see it's not black. We do still want to introduce a highlight though, so that we have sort of a 3-tier thing going on. So I've got here Dawnstone Dry and a makeup brush. These soft bristles are really useful for dry brushing. If it helps and you want to know, this is a Luxe pencil. So what I'll do is briefly flick along the edge of my base just to get an idea of what I will leave behind on the miniature. You really don't want to be leaving much at all at first. It's always better to be able to come back and add more paint than put too much on to start with. So what I'm going to do is run the brush mostly horizontally, because that tends to be how most of the detail on him is sculpted. But as you'll see, we catch particularly the ribbing in his undersuit there. On his gloves, I'm going to go vertically and around on his cloak. Just spend a bit of time building up some of the high points. And you'll see it doesn't take long until you get actually quite a nice transition of color. And if I do need to, I'll come back, add a little bit more paint to my brush and add another layer. But dry brushing Darth Vader, it is possible. It's always very funny to me that the lighter you make him, the darker he looks. With that dry brush applied, we've got some nice modulation of color, and we have a little bit more variety in that black. Obviously his armor looks kind of chalky, but we're not too worried about that. We are going to paint over that in a second. But first, I do want to add one final dry brush to the very edges of some of these areas. And for this, I'm using Longbeard Grey, and I'm going to a much smaller brush here. So same theory applies. Have a little brush before you go near the miniature, just to make sure you're not leaving behind too much paint. But I'm going to give this a much more focused dry brush along edges that I really want to accentuate. So, bottom of his cloak is going to be sort of the prime real estate for this, but also spots like just at the front of his arms here. Now that'll make some of the detail on his chest stand out a little more, but it also works really well on the cape. Now what I'm going to do, there is these ribs on the sort of mantlet on his chest here, and they changed color. Man, oh man, trying to find a single definitive reference for Vader's armor. Whew, these things, they changed quite a bit between Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. In Empire, they were almost black. Whereas for most of the other appearances, they're a very dark silvery grey. So I'm using basalt grey here. This is a Vallejo color, but you can just as easily use Mechanicus Standard Grey or Dawnstone, or there is no right answer. So I'm just going to fill these in, paint these flat sections with that grey. And then we'll start painting in the black armor. Now for this, I'm using German Grey from Vallejo. Again, we want to stick to anything which isn't a pure black, although you could use something like Abaddon Black here instead if you wanted to. German Grey, though, is just a little off black, and it has a very faint blue tint to it, which makes it a beautiful black armor color. So you'll see very quickly as this goes on, it's going to take a shade, but still look really sinister. So you'll see as we apply this, we're getting rid of some of the chalkiness in the armor, and because of that touch of blue in it, it's also going to make it stand apart from his clothing a little, which is super useful. Now we'll paint in these silver details, and for this I'm going to use Iron Hand steel, although any silver, middlingly bright, is going to be a good choice here. What we'll paint in is a little belt buckle dealy bopper, and of course, again, from Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi, Rebels, blah blah blah, they've all got different layouts for what buttons are what color on his chest. But I would suggest you will find it easiest to just paint all of them in silver first, because this will work as a pretty good base color for whatever you're doing. Don't worry too much if you do splat over them, because once we've shaded them, it's going to get rid of some of that. And don't forget, as I often do, now he's got a lightsaber that we have to pay some attention to. Now at this point, if you need to go back and tidy anything up, you can use your colors from before. I have tidied up his face where I accidentally blobbed in his snoot with a little bit of silver, but from there, everything else is pretty simple. What I've got now is a large shade brush and some Nuln oil. No great surprise. We're going to shade the entire miniature using the same thing. So all over his armor, all over his clothing, and you can be fairly generous with it. Just bucket this stuff on. Then we're going to leave him somewhere warm for about half an hour. Preferably not so warm it's by a river of lava. Obi-wan. Now that's not completely dry yet in some of the recesses, and you'll see it does dry just a little bit shiny in some areas, but we're going to fix that later obviously. Certainly from the front, we're on to a winner. There are a couple of details left to paint for his armor though. First off, I am going to highlight some of the very hard edges of his armor plates. For this I'm going back to basalt grey, and all I'm going to do is I've watered it down just a little more than usual, and I'm just going to tickle very edges of his helmet, his mask, and up the top of his boots. Now, if you do end up going a little overboard with this, your lines are too thick or you just miss, you've got shaky hands like I do sometimes, all you need to do is go back to your German grey and you can tidy up these little highlights. Really, the trick here is having just a tiny fraction on your brush at a time. Now we'll paint in the switches on his chest. Now, as with a lot of the other things of his costume, these would change from side to side based on which movie or show you're watching. So I'm going to go and put the red one on the far left, which I think, if I'm remembering correctly, that is the New Hope position. I think it turned to the right from Empire onwards. And then the lower of these two little dealy boppers, I'll apply some Calgar blue to the button on the top. Now on his belt there are a couple of light up sections, and again these change colour from every source. I'm going to use Nurgling green for a bright pale green light. And that's again looking at Empire Strikes Back. So that's now all of the armor and the body painted. We can move on now to the fun part. And I'm going to flip them upside down here because this will make this much easier. I have Corax White, and I've given that a really good shake. And I'm going to apply a couple of coats of this to the lightsaber. I always find it easiest holding them upside down because then I can start quite close to the hilt and just draw my brush away from it. Alright, 2 coats later, and we have a nice white glow-in-the-dark wiffle bat. The problem is, when it comes to painting a lightsaber, that we are painting something physical. Obviously, when it comes to a visual effect, as the actor moves the lightsaber around, the light that is shining from the center of it is always going to be correct to our eyes, because our position relative to the source doesn't really change. But when it comes to painting a miniature, if we paint this red and then just put a white stripe down the center of it to simulate where the light is coming from, it's only going to look correct from one angle. So we have to compromise. We're going to have to find a style that works to imply this thing is glowing. And for that, we're going to turn to a glaze. So in order to do this, we'll flip Vader upside down again. What I have is a mix. This is roughly half and half, contrast medium and Blood Angel's red. Now, if you are a little worried about having this precise, then I'd say just have a wee bit more red in there. It doesn't matter too much. We'll start by coating our whole lightsaber blade in this mix. Just quickly paint it over. Keep drawing your brush in the same direction, and whatever you do, don't do what I was about to do, and drop Vader. Now once that's dried, obviously you could leave it like that, but what I'm going to do, flip them upside down again, and I've got here a little bit of neat Blood Angel's red. What I'm going to use is an ordinary medium layer brush, and I'm going to solidify this color just towards the tip. So apply a couple of layers, a slightly scratchy finish to them. Now in hindsight, I probably should have used a little more medium when I first went in on that, but I'm not too unhappy with how that looks. But we're going to add a little bit more white now. What I'm using is rack white. This is a dry paint, and it's really useful for stippling. I've got a nasty ragged old brush here, and I really want to be very gentle with this. I haven't taken much paint off of my brush at all. What I'm going to do is just lightly stipple some of this white down the blade. So, in all honesty, nothing about this is going quite as I had expected. Instead of gently stippling, I ended up dry brushing most of this and just flicking backwards and forwards very carefully because, of course, we don't want to snap that blade. So what I'm going to do is I've gone back to my contrast medium and Blood Angel's red and thinned it down just a little bit more, because what we'll do is now that I've got some scratchy texture to the light, okay, I'm kind of liking how that looks, but it's not red enough. So if I, there we go. If I apply my red mix over that, we get a lightsaber with a bit of texture. Okay, cool. Now that finally looks much more like what I had in mind. So I think what you could get away with would be, after painting it white, just contrast the whole thing in red, do the scratchy dry brush, then thin and glaze. But honestly, I've had a week where nothing has really come out the way I wanted it to paint-wise. So sticking to it and having that come out a little bit more like I wanted, yeah, that's nice. That is quite satisfying. There is one last detail that I'm going to paint in using this Blood Angel's red, and that is to get a tiny wee dot of it into a very small brush, and I'm going to try and get this onto his lenses. And you'll see quite a few sort of really high light situations where you can see a reddish glow from in there, but I'm going to do this off camera. And not for the first time, I'm going to lament how difficult it is to get a camera to show you just what I see in reality, but that's pretty cool. What I'm going to do now is take him outside, and I'm going to hit him first of all with a spray of Munitorum varnish. Reason being, it's quite a high satin. It's not a true matte, so it's going to give us that slightly shiny effect on the armor without going up to a high gloss. I think gloss is going to be too much for most of Vader's gear. So we'll start off, let's satin varnish him. Now on the armor, particularly his helmet and the puffy bits of his undersuit, you'll see that looks the business. It reflects just enough light to catch those highlights. That's really nice. but it does look a little out of place on his clothing, so the soft stuff like his cape. Now there are a few options when it comes to matte varnishes that you can brush on. Now I'd suggest if you are in the EU, you can get Vallejo's Premium Matte very easily. In the UK though, one that I would suggest which is excellent is Varnish Plus. This is from a little place called Instar, and it is just the best that I've used. You don't have to thin this down, you can apply it straight from the pot. I'll squeeze a little out onto my palette, and I'm just going to apply this over all of his cape and the little bits of clothing at the front, which I want to be matte as well. Then we'll let that dry and get a look at what this looks like. Once that's had some time to dry, you're going to get a nice visible change in texture. It's not a perfect matte, especially not after having applied it over something a little glossy, but I think here from the front in particular, you'll see the difference between that little bit of tabard and his armor plating. So what I'm going to do now, at last, is to base him. I'll pop the recipe for that in the description. This is nice and quick. Let's get a look at what he looks like when he is all finished. So there at last is Lord Vader, complete, and I am pretty pleased with that. It's an interesting challenge to make so many areas of black look distinct to one another, but without introducing a huge range of colors. And I think by using a fairly limited palette, really only a handful of the same grays and blacks that we did, is quite a strong finish without having to go overboard on highlighting everything a different color. I like the style. I think you could take it quite a bit further if you were to highlight the black armor in a more specific fashion, but then we start getting into different styles entirely. And the idea here is to get something on the table which you can be pleased with and isn't perhaps so daunting as painstakingly highlighting all of that armor. So, as always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of the patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my producers Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Trainboy, Rod, and Jimmy. Your support lets me keep doing this stuff. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comments box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So, thank you very much for your time, one and all, and may the Force be with you.